In Ireland, they triple distill the whiskey because they couldn't get it right the first 2 times. So that's my dig at.
Get it right the 3rd time.
That's my dig at the Irish. By the way, John Jameson, who's a big Jameson whiskey, was a Scotsman. He was a Scotsman. He couldn't make whiskey, so we sent him to Ireland. Said, "Go over there and make your whiskey." Just kidding. I like Irish whiskey. And if you're going to drink Irish whiskey, drink Jameson. Okay. So ready to taste. Okay. So the next whiskey you're going to taste is the Nadura Cask Strength. Now this particular whiskey is 108 proof, so I should lose half of you here. Takes a little more water to open it up, and why this is a little bit of a different animal for Glenlivet. Most whiskies before they're bottled go through a couple of processes. One of them is they're diluted and taken down to bottling strength. So in the 15 and the 12 it's 80 proof, in the 18 and 21 it's 86 proof. But in the Nadura, whatever it came up the cask at strength, we put it into the bottle. In this particular case it was 108. Other whiskies are also chilled and filtered before they're bottled, and we didn't do that with the Nadura. We literally took it straight from the cask, put it in the bottle. So if you're at the distillery and they take you into the warehouse and let you taste whiskey straight from the cask, that's what you're tasting today. It is a little more intense and it does take a little more water, but once you get the sweet spot, it's amazing. 2 parts whiskey, 1 part water is probably a good start. I know it sounds like a lot of water, but trust me, it's a good start for the Nadura. Very intense on the palate. It still has a very sweet element to it, but the mouthfeel is different. The 15-year-old was buttery, it coated the mouth, it had a little gravity to it, but the Nadura is it's crisp. It almost has that little carbonated effect, like little what's those little pop rocks going off in your mouth. Now I'm making you salivate, right?
I like that.
Somebody says it does. It really does taste like pop rocks. It's delicious, isn't it?
She's Irish too.
She's Irish too. So how we doing so far, guys? Come on, how we doing so far? That's better. That's better. You know, people ask me a lot in this industry if I drink large consumptions of alcohol. What I tell people is, and you guys can use this from now on because it's one of my favorite lines. When somebody asks you if you drink a lot, you tell them you're a social drinker, okay? Which means if somebody else drinks, so shall I. So use it because it's the best one ever. Okay, so now that brings us up to maturation. Okay, so we talked about how the whiskey was made. We took all the finest distilled spirit that we have and we take it to the warehouse and we put it in casks. We put it in oak casks, and most of the casks we use are used bourbon casks, okay, American oak. We do use some Spanish oak in the 21 and the 18, and as you know we used a little bit of French oak in the 15, okay. The reason that we use oak is because it has some certain qualities to it. It's a hard wood, so it's very durable. They need to last a long time. Sometimes we reuse the casks. So some casks are 30 and 40, 50 years old sometimes. It's also pliable, which means we can shape it. But most importantly, it is non-resinous, okay? If we used a softer wood, it's a hard wood, it's non-resinous. If we used a softer wood like a pine, that pine would get into the whiskey and you would taste it in the whiskey. So that's one of the reasons that we're really using oak overall. Now, as the whiskey's maturing, what's happening is it sits in the barrel, and the change in temperature throughout the year, which is cold to colder in Scotland, the wood expands and contracts. And as it expands and contracts, the whiskey seeps into the wood and then comes back out of it again. But when it goes into the wood holds back a lot of the undesirable elements that were in this pure alcohol spirit. A lot of the sulfates and nitrates and some of the esters that were in there. At the same time, when the whiskey is in the wood is applying all its desirable elements to the whiskey, all the desirable flavors, your fruit, your floral, your honey, vanilla, spices, all your nutty elements, all going into the whiskey. So the longer it matures, the more of those elements are getting into the whiskey. Okay, and that's what's happening as the whiskey matures in the cask. Also, we have evaporation. So every year we lose about 2% volume out of the cask. 1% of that's alcohol. So Scotch actually decreases in strength as it matures. We call that the angel share that evaporates out of the cask. Okay, so when we go to a cask 12 years to get a 12-year-old whiskey, we've lost about 25% of what was in that cask. 10% of that's the guy in the warehouse just stealing it, but the other stuff is actual evaporation. Okay, so the next whiskey we're going to taste is my favorite, the 18-year-old Glenlivet. 90% of what's in the bottle and what's in your glass spent 18 years in American oak, used bourbon cask, as most of the industry does. 10% of what's in here spent 18 years in the sherry cask, used Spanish oak, okay? And after 18 years, we brought them together and bottled them. Now the Spanish oak again is a little softer, a little more porous, and it's very intense on the fruits and the spices it implies into the spirit. So we just wanted a little bit of that, and that's why we only use about 10%. Very complex, very balanced. It'll start off sweet. That honey, vanilla, fruity, floral element will be at the front of the palate, but at the end of the palate you'll get a little bit of a spice, a peppery spice. So yeah.
We have to use water on this one?
Okay, regardless of how much your whiskey costs you or how old it is, always add a splash of water. It really, really opens up. I know for some people that's hard to imagine, but it's the best way to drink it. It really is. So, very balanced, very complex, fruity floral with a little bit of a peppery spice. Hands down, my favorite single malt Scotch. It's probably one of the best out there. If I was on my deathbed and I could have one more single malt Scotch, it would be this. Which is why every night before I go to bed, just in case, have the 18. Okay, how are we doing? The 21 that you're about to taste, which is the same age as most of the people in here, right? You know, I'm actually 75. I look damn good for 75, right? So it happens if you drink a lot of whiskey. Okay, the 21-year-old matured the same way as the 18. 90% American oak, 10% sherry cask. Only those 3 additional years, some changes took place. Now the spices that you're getting are ginger, cinnamon spice. There's a little more of a smoky element on the nose. Not peat, because there's no peat in it, but more of that charcoal wood, but it's going to be difficult to get actually out of that cup. Also, the mouthfeel, a little more gravity to it again. More wood sugar in there, so there's more body to it, so it sits on the palate a little more again. Not quite as light and crisp as the 18 Odd and Nadura was. Add a little water. I was going to add more whiskey.
Here, you can use my glass for that. For added whiskey.
Guys, are there any questions? I'll take 1 or 2 questions from those guys back there talking on their own. Any questions, guys, at all? Yeah.
So what's the deal with the peat?
There used to be peat in every whiskey, because when you used to dry the barley, the fuel source that we used was peat, and peat's just a fossilized grass. It's like a soft coal. And when you burn that, it's very pungent and very smoky, and that would get within the barley, and it would stay within the whiskey throughout the whole process. But since the 50s and 60s, the Clean Fuel Acts, we literally were digging up all of Scotland for this peat. We couldn't do it anymore. So we used cleaner fuel sources, gases and oils and stuff like that. Some of the whiskey that's still peaty, like we don't use it at Glenlivet anymore, so there's no peat. Some of the whiskey that's still peaty is from the Isla. And Isla is just a big peat bog, and their water source already has peat in it. So they're getting their peat right from the water source, okay? Okay, guys, so before we do a toast, you guys want to hear a joke?
Yeah.
Okay, 2 Scotsmen walking their dogs, it's time for a drink. So it's probably about 8 a.m. So they go to the bar, and there's a sign outside the bar that says no dogs allowed. But the first guy ignores it, and he goes in and he says, "Bartender, give me a Glenlivet." Bartender says, "Sorry, you have a dog." He says, "But it's my C&I dog." The bartender looks over, he goes, "Okay, then I'll give you a drink." The second guy sees this and goes, "That's a good idea." He walks in, says, "Bartender, give me a drink." The bartender says, "Kent, you have a dog." He said, "It's my C&I dog." And the bartender looks over the bar and he says, "A Chihuahua?" The guy real quick says, "They gave me a Chihuahua?" That's a recent joke, so it's pretty good. Okay, so we'll finish with a toast, okay? Well, we got plenty of whiskey to cover it. Okay, so there are 3 types of people in the world, okay? There are those who drink Glenlivet. There are all those who want to drink Glenlivet. And there are those who have absolutely no ambition in life whatsoever.
Yeah.
Cheers, slams up.
Sounds about.
Thank you guys, you've been wonderful. Have a fun afternoon. Thank you very much.